The sun beat down on the white sand, a paradise untouched by the blood of men, where the only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the emerald waves and the distant call of a sea-bird. A soldier sat in the shade of a palm tree, wiping the salt spray from his glasses, a rare smile playing on his lips as the smoke from his cigarette curled lazily into the humid air. Then the world tore apart. A sound like canvas, ripping at the speed of sound, shattered the silence. A mechanical scream that drilled into the skull were heard, accompanied by the blinding strobe of muzzle flashes, and the frantic screams of Imperial soldiers shouting, "Teki! Teki!" as the earth exploded around them. The sky was empty, but the Japanese were diving for cover. They thought it was an airstrike, but it was just one black U.S. elite sniper holding a weapon that shouldn't exist. Before history erased his name, this soldier did the impossible. If you want to uncover the true stories of heroes the books forgot, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next mission. In 1944, segregation meant that a black U.S. elite sniper wasn't supposed to fight. He was supposed to cook or drive trucks. But when you strip a plane of its guns and hand them to a genius, you don't get a cook. You get a black U.S. elite sniper capable of wiping out a platoon in seconds. This represents the untold lethality of the black U.S. elite sniper in the Pacific Theater. Saipan was a graveyard of steel, a twisted monument to the ferocity of the air war, where the skeletons of SBD, Dauntless Dive Bombers, and Zero fighters lay rotting in the tropical sun, while the white officers drank lukewarm beer in the shade, dismissing the segregated support units as mere laborers. One man was wading through the wreckage with a wrench in his hand and a vision in his mind. He wasn't looking for souvenirs. He was looking for firepower. He looked at the shattered wing of a downed Navy fighter and saw the NM-2 light machine gun, a weapon designed to fire 1,200 rounds per minute, 3 times faster than anything the infantry carried. The Army said it was impossible to fire from the shoulder, that the recoil would break a man's collarbone. But the black U.S. elite sniper didn't care about regulations. He cared about survival. His unit was being chewed up in the dense jungle patrol, outgunned by Japanese Nambu nests that vanished into the foliage, and the standard-issue carbines were useless against the fortified bunkers. He needed a dragon, and he found it in the scrap heap. He worked in the dead of night, a phantom mechanic in a garage made of palm fronds, welding scrap metal with the precision of a surgeon. He took the aircraft gun, stripped away the heavy mounting bracket, and attached a buttstock carved from a crate of rations. He fashioned a trigger mechanism from the aluminum of a destroyed mess kit and stole a bipod from a broken bar rifle to handle the weight. The officers passed by, laughing at the Frankenstein creation, mocking the cook who thought he was an engineer. They called it a toy, a suicide machine that would explode in his hands. Unaware that the black U.S. elite sniper was engineering a solution to a problem they were too arrogant to understand. Then came the test. At the edge of the jungle, he pulled the trigger. The sound wasn't a bang, bang, bang. It was a continuous, terrifying buzzsaw that sheared through a thick palm tree in a blink of an eye. The laughter of the officers died instantly, replaced by a nervous silence. The weapon wasn't a joke. It was a handheld airstrike. The mission was a death sentence, a push into a valley known as the Throat, a choke point infested with hidden caves and spider holes that had already swallowed 2 patrols. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and fear. Suddenly, the jungle erupted. Invisible Japanese machine guns opened up from the tree line, pinning the platoon in a crossfire that shredded the vegetation and the men hiding behind it. The radio operator was hit. The lieutenant was screaming, paralyzed by the ferocity of the ambush. The standard M1 Garands popped uselessly against the thick logs of the enemy bunkers. They were trapped, dying in the mud, waiting for the final banzai charge that would finish them off. But then movement caught their eye. The black U.S. elite sniper was crawling forward, dragging his heavy, ugly creation through the dirt. His eyes locked on the muzzle, flashes in the darkness. He set up the bipod on a fallen log, wiped the mud from the receiver, and prepared to unleash hell. He squeezed the trigger, and the jungle screamed. The sound of the modified NN-2 was unmistakable. It was the sound of a fighter plane diving for the kill. The Japanese soldiers in the bunkers, conditioned by years of war to fear the American air superiority, stopped firing. They looked up through the canopy, eyes wide with terror, searching for the dive bomber they were sure was plummeting toward them. "Air raid! Take cover!" They screamed, abandoning their firing ports to curl into balls on the floor. But death wasn't coming from the clouds. It was coming from the ground. The black U.S. elite sniper swept the weapon across the enemy line, the 1,200 round per minute rate of fire acting like a scythe. The bullets didn't just penetrate the wooden bunkers. They disintegrated them, turning logs into splinters and sandbags into dust. He saw the enemy exposing themselves to look at the sky, and he cut them down. 1, 5, 10, 20. The weapon devoured ammunition, spitting a stream of brass that glowed like gold in the shadows. The enemy didn't even fire back. They were too busy hiding from the phantom plane. In seconds, the ambush was broken. The bunkers were silent, and 20 elite Imperial soldiers lay dead, killed by a man they never saw, fearing a plane that never existed. When the smoke cleared and the barrel of the homemade gun glowed cherry red, silence returned to the valley. The reinforcements arrived, weapons raised, expecting a firefight, but they found only carnage. The trees were cut in half, the bunkers were sawdust. Where was the air support? A breathless captain asked, looking at the devastation. "We didn't call for a strike." The surviving platoon members didn't speak. They just pointed to the black U.S. elite sniper, who was sitting on a stump, wrapping his burned hands in cool rags. The incredulity on the faces of the high command was palpable. They ordered the weapon confiscated, deeming it non-regulation, and buried the report to save their own careers. They tried to turn him back into a laborer, to erase the memory of the black U.S. elite sniper who had outsmarted an empire with trash and genius. But the men who walked out of that jungle alive knew the truth. They knew that when the sky was empty and hope was lost, it wasn't a plane that saved them. It was the man the army tried to forget. The humidity on Saipan was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of wet heat that smelled of rotting vegetation, salt spray, and the distinct, acrid scent of burnt aviation fuel. The captured airfield was a chaotic sprawl of destruction, a graveyard of steel where the skeletons of American and Japanese aircraft lay twisted together in a rusted embrace. To the casual observer, it was a junk heap, a mess to be bulldozed into the sea to make way for the new B-29 bombers. But to the soldier kneeling in the mud, his hands slick with oil and grease, it was a treasure chest. He was a member of a segregated supply unit, a man whose official designation in the United States Army was laborer, fit only to dig latrines, haul crates of ammunition, and drive trucks for the white officers who sat in the shade of the command tent, drinking lukewarm water and complaining about the mosquitoes. They didn't know that the man they ignored possessed a mind that understood mechanics better than their college-educated engineers. They didn't know they were looking at a dormant weapon, a black U.S. elite sniper who was currently disguised as a janitor of war. While the rest of his detail took a break, smoking cigarettes and trying to catch a breeze, he was deep inside the shattered fuselage of a wrecked SBD Dauntless dive bomber. The plane had crash-landed weeks ago, riddled with zero fire, its pilot long since buried, but the machinery remained. The soldier wasn't stripping the plane for souvenirs like the others who hunted for dashboard clocks or Japanese flags. He was looking at the wings, specifically the jagged hole where the cowling had been ripped away, revealing the dull gray receiver of a Browning .30 caliber NN2 machine gun. Most men looked at that gun and saw dead weight, a piece of aircraft ordnance that was useless without a plane to power it and a pilot to trigger it. But the soldier saw a solution to a nightmare that had been plaguing his nights. He ran his calloused fingers over the cooling jacket of the barrel. It was lighter than the infantry version, drilled with holes to dissipate the heat of high-altitude combat, and the internal mechanism was modified for a rate of fire that was terrifying to contemplate, 1,200 rounds per minute. His mind flashed back to the patrol 3 days ago. It had been a slaughter. His unit, armed with nothing but M1 carbines, weak, short-range rifles that felt like toys, had walked into a Japanese ambush in the density of the bamboo forest. The carbine rounds had popped uselessly against the thick coconut logs of the enemy bunkers, bouncing off like pebbles. He had watched his friends die, cut to ribbons by Nambu machine guns that fired so fast they sounded like tearing canvas. The American infantry weapons were too slow, too weak to penetrate the jungle cover. They needed a scythe, a way to clear the brush and the enemy hiding behind it. But the army wouldn't give heavy weapons to a support unit. The anger simmered in his gut, a cold, hard knot. The white officers called them cowards when they retreated, but they hadn't seen the bullets failing to stop the charging enemy. He knew that if they went back into the throat with carbines, they were dead men. He looked back at the aircraft gun. The NN2 was a beast born for the sky, designed to shred aluminum and glass in dogfights at 300 miles per hour. It wasn't meant to be held by a human. It had no stock, no sights, no trigger guard, and a recoil that was rumored to be strong enough to crack an airframe if the mounting bolts were loose. But as the soldier turned the wrench, fighting the rusted bolts, a plan began to form in the architecture of his mind. He wasn't thinking like a grunt. He was thinking like an inventor. He visualized the internal spring tension. He calculated the weight distribution. If he could strip the solenoid trigger, if he could weld a Garand buttstock to the rear receiver plate, if he could adapt a bipod from a wrecked bar to handle the nose weight. It was a Frankenstein idea, a mechanical heresy that would violate a dozen Army regulations. He finally freed the gun from the wing mount, the heavy steel clunking into his arms. It was heavy, but not unmanageable. He held it waist high, feeling the balance. It was raw power, cold and indifferent. He looked toward the command tent, where the officers were laughing, oblivious to the fact that the war was about to change. They saw a pile of trash. He saw the stinger. In that moment the laborer died, and the black U.S. elite sniper was born. He wasn't going to wait for the quartermaster to send better weapons that would never arrive. He was going to build his own. He wrapped the machine gun in a greasy tarp, hoisting it onto his shoulder like a bag of laundry, and began the long walk back to the motor pool. The jungle was waiting, and for the first time, He smiled. He had found the answer to the ambush, and it fired 20 rounds a second. The motor pool was a sanctuary of shadows and grease, lit only by the intermittent, angry hiss of an acetylene torch that cast dancing, demonic silhouettes against the corrugated metal walls. While the rest of the base slept, exhausted by the heat and the fear, the soldier was awake, engaged in an act of mechanical alchemy. He was huddled over a workbench, scattered with the refuse of war-twisted metal, broken springs, and the cannibalized remains of infantry weapons. The center of his attention was the NN-2 aircraft machine gun, stripped naked of its mounting brackets, looking like a dark industrial slab of death. The engineering challenge was immense, a puzzle that would have baffled the university-trained ordnance officers sleeping in their cots. The aircraft gun was designed to be fired electrically by a solenoid, triggered by a button on a pilot's stick. It had no trigger for a human hand. The black U.S. elite sniper had to invent one. He took a discarded ammunition tin, the metal jagged and sharp, and began to cut. He wasn't using blueprints. The schematics were burning in his mind, fueled by the memory of the ambush and the desperate need for fire superiority. He bent the metal into a crude trigger grouping, drilling holes with a hand crank, his movements precise and obsessive. He needed a stock. A machine gun firing at 1,200 rounds per minute would have a recoil impulse violent, enough to dislocate a shoulder or shatter a jaw, if not properly braced. He found the shattered remains of an M1 Garand rifle in the burn pit, the wood charred, but the butt plate intact. He sawed, sanded, and bolted the wooden stock to the rear of the aircraft gun's receiver. It looked ugly. It looked wrong. It looked like a Frankenstein monster stitched together from the graveyard of battle. But when he shouldered it, pulling it tight against his body, it felt solid. Next came the front stability. He scavenged a bipod from a Browning automatic rifle bar that had been twisted in a mortar blast. He heated the metal, hammered it straight on the anvil of a truck bumper, and welded it to the perforated cooling jacket of the NN-2. The sparks showered down on his arms, burning his skin, but he didn't flinch. He was forging a dragon. By the time the sun began to bleed through the cracks in the wall, the weapon was finished. It was a monstrosity of raw steel and scavenged wood, a weapon that existed in no manual, created by a black U.S. elite sniper who refused to accept that his unit was destined to die. The morning light brought with it the inevitable scrutiny of the hierarchy. As he wiped the cosmoline and soot from the finished weapon, a shadow fell across the workbench. It was Lieutenant Graves, a young officer fresh from the academy, whose uniform was still too clean, and whose disdain for the segregated troops was worn as openly as his rank. Graves stared at the contraption sitting on the oily rag. It looked grotesque compared to the sleek, mass-produced lines of standard-issue weaponry. A gaggle of other soldiers gathered around, snickering, pointing at the welds and the mismatched parts. "What in God's name is that?" Graves asked, a sneer curling his lip. "You building a sculpture, Private? Or are you planning to hunt elephants?" The laughter rippled through the onlookers. They saw a desperate, foolish attempt by a man reaching above his station. "That receiver will melt after 50 rounds, a sergeant commented, shaking his head. "And look at that trigger. It'll probably jam open and explode in your face. You're going to kill yourself, boy." They mocked the ambition of the black U.S. elite sniper. They called it a pipe dream and a waste of government property. Graves kicked the leg of the bipod. "You think you know better than the Ordnance Department? Those guns are for planes." They rely on the slipstream of air at 300 miles an hour to cool the barrel. You fire that on the ground and it'll seize up before you finish a belt. Stick to driving trucks. The humiliation was public and stinging, but the soldier didn't look down. He looked Graves in the eye. "It won't seize, sir," he said, his voice calm, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And it won't jam. Let me test it." The lieutenant laughed a harsh, barking sound. "Fine. Go ahead. Let's see your toy fall apart. Take it to the south perimeter. But when it breaks, you're on latrine duty for a month." The procession to the edge of the jungle was like a funeral march for a fool. The officers stood back, arms crossed, expecting a comedy of errors. The soldier carried the weapon. It weighed nearly 30 pounds, fully loaded, with a grim determination. He set the bar bipod on a sandbag, settled the Garand stock into his shoulder, and fed a 100-round belt of .3006 ammunition into the feed tray. The copper bullets gleamed in the sun. He looked down the barrel. There were no sights. He hadn't found any, so he would have to aim by instinct, walking the tracers onto the target. He aimed at a cluster of thick palm trees 50 yards away, the kind of cover that had stopped the carbine rounds during the ambush. The officers were making bets on how many seconds it would last. The black U.S. elite sniper took a deep breath, leaned his entire body weight forward to counteract the recoil, and squeezed his homemade metal trigger. The result was not a gunshot. It was a rip in the fabric of reality. The sound was terrifying, a continuous, high-pitched brrrt that sounded like canvas being torn by a giant. It was a roar that drowned out every other sound on the island. The muzzle flash was a blinding, continuous flame that extended 3 feet from the barrel. The recoil was violent, shaking the soldier's body like a ragdoll, but he held on, riding the lightning. Downrange, the effect was apocalyptic. The palm trees didn't just take hits. They disintegrated. The sheer volume of Fire 20 rounds every single second acted like a chainsaw. The trunks shattered, exploding into clouds of splinters and pulp. The vegetation behind them was mowed down as if by an invisible scythe. In 5 seconds, he fired the entire 100-round belt. The silence that followed was deafening. Smoke poured from the cooling jacket, drifting over the stunned faces of the officers. Graves' mouth was open. The sergeant had dropped his cigarette. The trees were gone. The black U.S. elite sniper stood up, the heat radiating from the weapon, and looked at them. He hadn't just built a gun. He had bottled a hurricane. Before anyone could speak, a jeep skidded to a halt nearby. A captain jumped out, his face pale and grim, clutching a map case. He didn't notice the destroyed trees or the smoking contraption immediately. He looked at the gathered platoon with the hollow eyes of a man delivering a death sentence. "Listen up," he barked. Command just came down. The northern sector. The caves. A collective groan went through the men. The caves were a fortress of coral and volcanic rock, a labyrinth where the Japanese had dug in so deep that naval bombardment couldn't touch them. 2 companies had already been chewed up trying to take the entrance. It was a suicide mission. Intelligence says they have heavy machine gun nests covering the approach, the captain continued. Our carbines can't suppress them. We need heavy firepower to get close enough to use flamethrowers. He looked around at the lightly armed men, seeing the fear. Then his eyes fell on the smoking, ugly beast of a weapon, sitting on the sandbags and the destruction downrange. He looked at the black U.S. elite sniper. "What the hell is that?" he asked. The soldier patted the hot receiver of his creation. "It's the answer, sir," he said. The captain didn't laugh. He looked at the shredded trees, then at the soldier. "Grab all the ammo you can carry," the captain ordered. "You're on point." The jungle into which the platoon marched was not merely a landscape. It was a predatory organism, a suffocating green throat that swallowed light and sound with equal indifference. The air was a physical weight, a wet, hot blanket smelling of mold and ancient decay that clogged the lungs and turned sweat into a blinding, stinging film over the eyes. This was the throat, a narrow ravine of volcanic rock choked with elephant grass and banyan trees, a place where the map was useless and the compass spun in lazy, confused circles. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of an empty room. It was the held breath of a predator before the strike. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. Every rustle of a fern sounded like a movement of a bolt. The men were on edge, their eyes darting wildly into the impenetrable wall of foliage, their knuckles white on the stocks of their rifles. They knew the Japanese were here. They could feel the eyes watching them from the shadows, counting them, waiting for the kill zone to fill up. The black U.S. elite sniper walked near the center of the column, the crushing weight of his homemade weapon digging into his shoulder strap, the tarp covering it slick with humidity. He didn't look at the trees. He looked at the ground, reading the subtle disturbances in the mud that whispered of buried danger. Then the silence didn't break. It shattered. It started with a single, metallic click. The sound of a knee mortar dropping a round into the tube followed instantly by a terrifying, overlapping roar of automatic fire. The ambush was initiated with perfect, ruthless synchronization. From the roots of the trees, from behind walls of vines, and from the earth itself, the Japanese opened fire. Spider holes, perfectly camouflaged with lids of grass and dirt, flipped open like trapdoors to hell, revealing snipers and machine gunners who were practically invisible until the muzzle flashes bloomed. The platoon was flayed alive. In the first 3 seconds, 6 men went down, their bodies jerking violently as the 6.5mm rounds tore through them. The air was instantly filled with the snapping sound of supersonic bullets and the screams of the wounded. Contact, left flank, right flank, everywhere. The shouts of the NCOs were swallowed by the cacophony. The men dove for the mud, pressing their faces into the rot, firing blindly into the green wall that was eating them alive. The desperation of the situation became clear within moments. The American return fire was frantic but futile. The soldiers leveled their M1, Garands, and carbines, pouring rounds into the muzzle flashes, but the Japanese were dug in behind fortifications built of coconut logs and coral rock, layers of density that absorbed the standard infantry rounds like a sponge. The American bullets chipped the wood, ricocheted off the stone, and thumped harmlessly into the dirt. They were fighting ghosts protected by armor. Lieutenant Graves, the officer who had mocked the sniper's invention, tried to rally the squad on the right. He stood up, waving his pistol, screaming for a base of fire. A burst from a Nambu machine gun caught him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the fern. The radio operator, scrambling to call for mortar support, took a round through the radio set, the sparks showering his face as the lifeline to the outside world died in a hiss of static and broken vacuum tube. They were cut off. They were surrounded. They were dying. The panic began to set in, a cold, jagged shard of ice in the heat of the battle. The surviving officers were pinned down, terrified, realizing that their training manuals had no answer for an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't kill. The platoon sergeant was screaming for a withdrawal, but there was nowhere to go. The Japanese had closed the back door of the ambush. They were in a kill box, and the walls were closing in. The volume of enemy fire increased, sensing the American weakness. The thump, thump, thump of the heavy machine guns chewed through the trees, dropping branches onto the huddled survivors, systematically dismantling their cover. It was a massacre in slow motion. The men looked at each other with the hollow eyes of the doomed, clutching empty magazines, waiting for the final blow. In the center of this blood-soaked chaos, the black U.S. elite sniper did not panic. He was face down in the mud, the bullets snapping inches above his helmet, but his hands were busy. He was dragging the heavy, canvas-wrapped bundle forward, inch by agonizing inch, crawling over the roots and the bodies of the fallen. He ignored the screams. He ignored the terror. He focused on the geometry of the ambush. He saw where the fire was coming from, a reinforced bunker disguised as a termite mound at the base of a massive banyan tree, and a series of spider holes lining the ridge. Conventional weapons had failed. The officers had failed. The doctrine had failed. It was time for the machine. He reached a fallen log that offered a sliver of cover, facing the heart of the Japanese line. His muscles burned from the weight of the 30-pound gun, but his movements were deliberate. The firing from the Japanese side suddenly slackened. It wasn't a retreat. It was a breath. The ominous clatter of bayonets being fixed to Arisaka rifles drifted across the small clearing. They were preparing for the banzai charge, the final psychological and physical wave intended to overrun the broken American survivors with cold steel. The surviving GIAs heard it too, the low chant beginning to rise from the jungle floor, a sound that froze the blood. They gripped their knives and empty rifles, preparing to die. But the black U.S. elite sniper reached down and ripped the oil-stained canvas off his weapon. The Stinger gleamed in the dappled sunlight, ugly, scarred, and magnificent. He kicked the legs of the bar bipod out, digging the feet into the rotting wood of the log. He racked the charging handle of the NN-2, the sound of the heavy bolt slamming home, echoing like a judge's gavel. He settled the rough, hand-carved stock into his shoulder, feeling the cold steel against his cheek. The chant grew louder. The bushes began to rustle as the enemy rose to charge. The black U.S. elite sniper exhaled, his finger curling around the jagged metal of his homemade trigger. The air raid was about to begin on the ground. The jungle held its breath for the fraction of a second that precedes a slaughter, the air vibrating with the impending scream of the banzai charge. The Imperial soldiers, confident in the terrifying proximity of their bayonets and the shattered morale of the American unit, rose from the ferns like demons born of the earth. They were 20 yards away, close enough for the Americans to see the gold teeth of the officers and the fanatical width of their eyes. The surviving GIs, their weapons empty or jammed, curled into the mud, bracing for the cold steel. But the black U.S. elite sniper did not flinch. He leaned his entire body weight forward, driving the spiked feet of the stolen bipod into the rotting log. His cheek welded to the rough hand-carved stock of the monstrosity he had built in the shadows. He didn't pick a single target. He aimed at the horizon of the charge. He squeezed the jagged metal trigger, and the world dissolved into noise. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a mechanical shriek, a continuous, tearing roar that sounded exactly like a jagged tear in the fabric of the sky. Brr-rut. The rate of fire was 1,250 rounds per minute, more than 20 bullets leaving the barrel every single second. The sound was unmistakable to every soldier in the Pacific Theater. It was the sound of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber peeling out of a cloud, the sound of a corsair strafing a beachhead. It was the sound of death from above. The psychological effect was instantaneous and absolute. The Japanese soldiers, mid-stride in their charge, froze. Their training, drilled into them by years of air superiority battles, overrode their immediate tactical awareness. They heard the engine of a plane. They heard the scream of aerial machine guns. Their eyes didn't look at the black U.S. elite sniper. They snapped upward, searching the canopy for the wings of the aircraft they were certain was diving on top of them. Techie, sure. Enemy plane. Air raid. The screams tore through the Japanese line. Instead of rushing the final yards to massacre the Americans, they threw themselves to the ground, covering their heads, waiting for the bombs to fall. But the bombs were not falling. The fire was coming from the mud. The black U.S. elite sniper unleashed the full fury of the Stinger. The muzzle flash was a blinding, 3-foot tongue of white-hot flame that illuminated the jungle gloom like a lightning strike that refused to fade. He didn't fire in bursts. He held the trigger down, riding the violent recoil that threatened to dislocate his shoulder, wrestling the dragon as it spat copper and lead. The effect on the target area was catastrophic. The standard infantry weapons had pecked at the jungle. This weapon devoured it. The stream of .3006 armor-piercing rounds acted like a high-velocity chainsaw. The thick banyan trees that had protected the Japanese snipers didn't just splinter. They were sawed in half, toppling over with crashing thuds. The dense elephant grass was mowed down as if by a giant invisible blade, revealing the terrified soldiers hiding beneath. The sniper swept the barrel left to right, a scythe of God. He targeted the reinforced log bunker that had pinned them down for hours. The logs, which had shrugged off carbine rounds, disintegrated under the hammer blow of 20 rounds impacting the same square foot in under a second. The wood exploded into a cloud of deadly splinters. The sandbags evaporated into dust. The screaming from inside the bunker was silenced abruptly as the cover vanished, followed by the men behind it. The Japanese soldiers who had hit the deck to avoid the air raid found no safety on the ground. The bullets churned the earth, tearing through the foliage and the men hiding within it. It was a massacre of industrial efficiency. There was no time to aim, no time to react, no time to regret. There was only the roar of the NM-2 and the pink mist of vaporized enemies. The black U.S. elite sniper was in a trance, his vision vibrating from the shock waves of the muzzle blast. Brass casings ejected from the side of the weapon in a solid stream, a golden fountain that piled up hot and smoking against his arm. He didn't feel the burns. He didn't hear the shouts of his own platoon mates who were watching in stunned disbelief. He only saw the destruction. An Imperial officer, realizing too late that there was no plane, tried to stand and draw his sword. The sniper shifted his aim a fraction of an inch. A half-second burst, 10 bullets hit the officer. He didn't fall. He was erased, thrown backward as if hit by a truck, his body torn apart by the kinetic energy. The weapon was starving for ammunition, devouring the belt with terrifying speed. The 100-round belt, which would last a normal rifleman 10 minutes of combat, was gone in 5 seconds of continuous fire. He grabbed the next belt, his movements blurry with speed, the muscle memory of the mechanic taking over. Click-clack, he racked the bolt. The Japanese survivors, realizing the fire was coming from the ground, tried to return fire, but they were suppressed by the sheer violence of the Stinger. They couldn't lift their heads. The air around them was filled with lead. The black U.S. elite sniper opened up again, cutting down the reinforcements trying to flank through the bamboo. The bamboo shattered, exploding into shrapnel that multiplied the lethality of the rounds. It was total dominance. In less than 2 minutes, the landscape of the battle had changed from a lush, fortified jungle into a smoking wasteland of stumps and churned earth. The scream of the stinger drowned out everything, the fear, the history, the segregation, the doubt. There was only the undeniable reality of firepower. And then the bolt locked back. The sudden silence was louder than the gunfire. The weapon clicked dry, the last brass casing tinkling softly as it hit the pile of hundreds of others. The black U.S. elite sniper held the trigger for a split second longer, but the Dragon was empty. He slumped forward, gasping for air, his uniform soaked in sweat and oil, the heavy weapon smoking in his hands. The barrel was glowing a dull, angry red, the heat shimmering in the air, distorting the view of the carnage ahead. Smoke drifted lazily from the muzzle, curling up toward the canopy where the Japanese had looked for the plane that never was. Downrange there was no movement, no screaming, no banzai chat, just the stillness of the grave. 20 elite soldiers of the Imperial Army lay dead in the shredded remains of their fortifications, their bodies twisted and broken, victims of a technological surprise they couldn't comprehend, even in death. The black U.S. elite sniper lowered his head, his ringing ears slowly registering the sound of the jungle returning, the drip of sap from severed branches, the distant call of a bird, and the ragged, disbelief-filled breathing of the Americans who were still alive, staring at the back of the man who had just brought the sky down to the earth. The smoke hung low over the throat, a gray, acrid shroud that refused to dissipate in the humid air, clinging to the devastation like a phantom. When the reinforcements finally pushed through the jungle, weapons raised and adrenaline pumping, they stopped dead in their tracks, their boots sinking into a carpet of sawdust and pulverized vegetation. They had come expecting to relieve a besieged platoon, to fight their way into a kill zone, but instead, they walked into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The towering banyan trees were gone, reduced to jagged stumps that smoked in the twilight. The dense elephant grass had been shaved down to the mud. The formidable Japanese bunkers, which had terrified the entire battalion, were nothing but piles of splintered logs and collapsed earth. A major, stepping out of his jeep at the edge of the clearing, took off his helmet and wiped his brow, staring at the carnage with bewildered eyes. "Good work getting air support," he muttered to the surviving sergeant. "I didn't know the Navy had Corsairs operating this close to the deck. That looks like a 500-pound bomb hit it." The sergeant, his face a mask of soot and dried blood, didn't salute. He just shook his head slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. "No planes, sir," he rasped, his voice ruined by the screaming of the battle. "No bombs. No Navy." The major frowned, looking around the silent jungle. "Don't lie to me, Sergeant. I know what an airstrike looks like. Nothing infantry carries can cut a tree in half. Who cleared this valley?" The sergeant didn't speak. He simply turned and pointed to the edge of the clearing. There, sitting alone on a crate of ammunition that was now empty, sat the black U.S. elite sniper. He looked nothing like a hero in the Army manuals. His uniform was torn, his hands were wrapped in bloody rags, and he was slumped over a grotesque, ugly assemblage of metal and wood that was still radiating heat waves into the air. He was dripping with sweat, his eyes fixed on the ground, the adrenaline crash leaving him trembling. The major walked over, his boots crunching on the spent brass casings that littered the ground, hundreds of them. piled in a golden drift around the soldier's feet. He looked down at the weapon. It was hideous to his trained eye, a scavenged aircraft gun welded to a broken rifle stock, held together by sheer will and unauthorized engineering. It was a violation of every protocol in the Ordnance Handbook. What in God's name is that monstrosity? The major demanded, his voice sharp with the indignation of a bureaucrat confronting chaos. The black U.S. elite sniper looked up, his eyes weary but unashamed. "It's the reason we're alive, sir," he said quietly. The major didn't hear him. He saw a liability. He saw a breach of discipline. He saw a piece of equipment that didn't exist and therefore couldn't be controlled. "It's non-regulation," the major snapped, kicking the bipod of the Stinger. "You stripped government property from a downed aircraft? That is a court-martial offense, soldier. We don't fight wars with junk. We fight with issued equipment." The injustice of the moment was suffocating. The surviving platoon members stepped forward, eyes wide, wanting to scream that the junk had just saved 20 lives, that the issued equipment had gotten them killed. But the hierarchy of 1944 was a wall of iron. The major turned to his aide. "Confiscate that thing, have it dismantled and thrown in the ocean, and get this man back to his unit. I want him peeling potatoes or driving a truck by 0800 tomorrow. He's lucky I don't write him up for destruction of government property." The black U.S. elite sniper didn't fight. He knew the war he was fighting was on 2 fronts, and he could only win the one with bullets. He stood up, his body aching, and watched as 2 MPs struggled to lift the heavy weapon he had wielded like a toy. They carried away his masterpiece, the Stinger, the dragon that had roared for one glorious afternoon. It would be thrown into a coral reef, lost to the rust and the tides. He was stripped of his title, stripped of his weapon, and sent back to the shadows of the support lines. The history books would mention a hard-fought engagement in the valley. They would credit the victory to aggressive infantry tactics. They would erase the man and the machine. But as the black U.S. elite sniper walked back toward the trucks, leaving the battlefield behind, he didn't look back with regret. He looked at his hands burned, scarred, and capable. The officers could take the gun. They could burn the records. They could ignore his name. But they couldn't take the truth that was burned into the minds of every man who survived that day. They had learned a lesson that no manual could teach, that the weapon is just a tool, dead steel and wood, until it is touched by the spirit of a warrior. They thought they had disarmed him by taking his invention, but they were wrong. The lethality wasn't in the welding or the aircraft parts. It was in the mind that saw a way where there was none. It was in the heart that refused to yield. The weapon was gone, but the black U.S. elite sniper remained, a silent legend walking among them, proving that true power doesn't come from a rank or a regulation, but from the unbreakable will to survive.